Thank you, Jerry, and thank you, EFC, for giving me this opportunity to speak to you today. I'm really grateful. What I'm going to do this morning is share some of my thoughts about the challenges currently facing us all as foundations, particularly in the light of the global financial crisis. I think we're in a context at the moment which demands that we raise our game and we really become focused on how we're going to achieve the major social change that we're all working towards. I'm actually going to frame my talk around opportunities, operational choices, relationships, and the approaches we take towards social change. Although it might seem that what we're facing is more difficult than ever, I do think we can raise our game. I do think we can become more creative. And I'm going to touch briefly on some examples from the Diana Princess of Wales Memorial Fund as I go through my talk. So just briefly, well, of course, the Diana Princess of Wales Memorial Fund was set up on August the 31st, well, after the death of the Princess, on August the 31st, 1997. And I think one of the things that's interesting about us as an organisation is that it was never envisaged that we would exist in perpetuity. We knew we were going to spend out, and in fact, 5 years ago, at the beginning of our final strategic plan, we agreed that we would spend out in 5 years. We closed this year. We closed at the end of 2012. And I was hired really to come in and deliver that final strategic plan. I think we're a very different organisation now to the one we were when I first joined, and I'll come back to that a little later in my speech. But I just want to briefly headline some outcomes that we've achieved or contributed to. We're not going to attribute them to us, but in the last 5 years, we have achieved an international ban on cluster bombs. We have seen a reduction in youth imprisonment in the UK of 40%. We have successfully integrated palliative care into 7 countries in sub-Saharan Africa, and I do believe that children in the UK seeking asylum are now being treated more humanely. Still a long way to go on all of these issues, but some of the headline successes. I mean, in all, it's been a really memorable journey, and I think Spend Out has absolutely focused the mindset of the fund in squeezing out every last opportunity. So back to the current context. We're all acutely aware of the global financial crisis and the context that we're facing. There's widespread uncertainty across Europe about the future of our economies and a background of austerity, which I believe genuinely is leading to greater levels of disadvantage in society. And foundations who work from a social justice perspective will be very aware of the increasing gaps between rich and poor, as well as the ongoing battle for equality in our society. These are big challenges. The question is, how do we as foundations step up? I'm sure that there are many different answers to this, including the balance that some foundations are facing about how to meet this new greater need and challenge where their own resources are shrinking. But firstly, I'm going to talk about, it might sound quite boring, but operational choices, because I think as organisations, in order to meet these needs, we actually have to look at our structure. The first thing that I did at the fund really was realise that our board was meeting 6 times a year to talk about very small grants. We also had about 12 committee meetings a year. And in fact, this wasn't giving our board any opportunity to look at high-level strategy or outcomes. I therefore, in my first year, got authority from the board to sign off any grant under £500,000 is done by the senior staff team. And this suddenly freed them to look at the big picture, to not fiddle around with the small grants, but to say, are we on track to ban cluster bombs? Are we being audacious enough? I mean, this is a fantastic thing for a board to do. And I urge chief executives, you don't have to keep the structure that you've got just because you always have. Is it fit for purpose? And is it enabling you to deliver excellence and be focused on the outcome, be focused on the goal? At the same time as this, I changed the staff team. Now, this is something that I don't think foundations think enough about. We went from having some very good generalist grant-making staff to hiring experts in the fields where we wanted to create change. This gave us an opportunity to speak as an organisation, to speak to government and to speak to others in the voluntary sector with a far greater authority, because those people actually knew what they were talking about. I'm not saying we've always got it right, and it's certainly been very challenging because as soon as you get experts with their own voice, NGOs and others working in the voluntary sector can feel quite protective and very challenged. But I do believe it's been a fundamental brick in helping us achieve our outcomes and goals. The final opportunity I think that we've got as foundations in meeting the challenges facing us is to look at the actual way we do our work. Are our grant-making processes fit for purpose? Are you being proportionate? Are you actually reading any of the information that we're demanding from reports? I mean, one of the biggest grants that we made was £1.5 million over 5 years to the Prison Reform Trust. And the outcome we were looking for was very simple. It was go ahead and reduce youth imprisonment in the UK. We actually became very light touch with that grant. Our input was co-founding with them a normative evaluation group right at the beginning that worked with them throughout the process to extract learning. The details of their tactics, the details of their expenditure, we were very flexible on, and they were freed to go forth and reduce child and youth imprisonment, and we had a relationship of absolute trust. The second set of opportunities that I see for foundations in this current global financial crisis revolve around relationships. At the Global Philanthropy Forum conference in Washington, D.C. in April, the theme was all about new forms of relationships that are needed between those working in philanthropy, government and the private sector. Indeed, the head of USAID talked about how the most difficult social problems will not be solved without USAID working with other sectors. And that same call was made by some of the largest foundations in the world. I think we have to look to the private sector. Many companies at the moment are looking at their own corporate social responsibility programs and moving from that model to bringing philanthropy as far more of their core business in their actual business approach. I know this is controversial for many, and I do have a healthy scepticism about the motivations of some coming in from the private sector. But I would never rule out working in partnership with new partners in order to address the most persistent social problems of our time. In our palliative care programme in sub-Saharan Africa, we very deliberately worked with government because if we didn't integrate it into health systems, we're closing. We had to absolutely try and ensure that sustainability would come from the top level. It would come from persuading international funders to fund it from PEPFAR levels down, that governments had it in their health strategies, that nursing school and medical schools were teaching it, that morphine was available, and then that there was practice on the ground that actually could roll out and deliver and make difference to people on the ground. And it's not an easy task, and it's particularly difficult in the fragile economic and political context of many African countries. But both in our work in the UK and in Africa, we have formed direct relationships with government where it's been helpful or necessary. And that's not always been received well by our grantees. But it's all about trying to find the ways to overcome situations where projects and programs might be seeking to deliver on the ground, but they're not looking up at how to achieve systemic change, and sometimes that's what's required. Of course, there are other types of relationships that funders can forge, and one of them is collaborating with each other. In several areas of the fund's work, for example, tackling the treatment of women in the UK in the criminal justice system, or trying to reduce the impact of HIV/AIDS on children in Malawi, we've collaborated closely with other foundations. And once again, it's not always been easy. I have to say at times I've probably been tested to the limit of my patience and really fundamentally had some of the assumptions that I have about how my organisation should run tested. But I do think the outcome has been better, and I do think that we have had more impact. And I do think against austerity and crisis and all the issues we face, foundations must seriously think about whether working with others will help them scale up, not only in terms of the money, but also in terms of the expertise and the impact. In summary, I think we have to be creative about the relationships that we have with foundations and be creative about who we collaborate with. Working with partners may seem difficult at first, but who knows, it may help us create greater impact. Okay, the final set of opportunities that I see for foundations relate to the behaviours and the tactics that we use. After the last year or so, we've commissioned a major piece of research which explores the range of options that we've chosen in our what we call Funder Plus approach, as well as investigating examples from other foundations and philanthropists, some of whom I can see in this room. We're going to be publishing a report in September called A Funder Conundrum, and I can share some of the learnings from that report with you now. What it says is that we could all be a lot better at selecting the tactics we use, and we need to get a hell of a lot better at communicating what those tactics are externally to other funders, to other grantees. If you've got a theory of change, and I apologise for using that phrase, but it's the only one I can really think that encapsulates what we try and do, you've got to talk about what it is. It's one of the mistakes we made. We thought that our grantees would just know that because we said we wanted to ban cluster bombs, we were going to start working in a very different way. Do you know, they didn't know, and I think some of the tension in the relationships that we had at the beginning, as we really did change our mode of working and went for that direct lobbying ourselves, could have been avoided if we'd just been a lot clearer. I'm thinking about that right now in terms of exit. We think, my goodness, we've been telling everyone for years that we're closing, but people remain surprised. So my task when I go back to the foundation is to get a really clear and coherent exit strategy on our website. Because again, don't assume, I mean, I've written 800 letters this year, which I have personally signed and topped and tailed. But still you have to keep giving that message through because it takes a long time for people to absorb. Some of the other things we need to think about is really being clear about how much risk you're prepared to take. Are you willing to enter the arena of campaigning and policy change where it might be more difficult for you to see if you're having an impact? Are you willing for your own foundation to have a voice? And have you considered spending more now to scale up what you can achieve? On this last point, I can genuinely say it's been an absolute privilege to be a part of a Spend Out Foundation. There are challenges in closing it down. It's spending far more time with lawyers than I would necessarily like, but I really think we've been more creative in the last few years. I think because we selected a very small number of ambitious goals, we've been more effective in achieving it. And I'm not suggesting that all foundations should spend out, not at all. But I do think if you think about it every few years, it might trigger in you really thinking about, are you being ambitious enough? Are you setting clear goals with a time frame? Because if you know you're going to close, you can't go back and do it a second time. So just the discipline of thinking about spending your capital now, I think can be helpful to people across the field. There are other choices, of course, for foundations about how engaged you are as a funder, whether you go beyond giving grants, whether you become Funder Plus. And this takes me back, I suppose, to the wider context. It might be strange against the background of this particular session, which is about the financial crisis, that I focused on opportunities. But I believe there's actually no better time than a crisis for you to look at what you do and how you do it. I think we are in such an enviable position of being able to experiment with how we work, to explore new solutions to old problems, and to forge new and possibly unexpected relationships. If we raise our game now, and if we're efficient in what we do now, I do believe we can genuinely increase our impact as a sector. And I suppose to close, if there's one thing I've learned in my work, that the social problems we choose to tackle and achieving social justice may be hard to achieve. But if we let go of some of our preconceptions, if we let go of some of the structures that we've inherited, if we actually go into our board meetings and saying, do you know what? You should not be looking at the tiny grants. You should not be making decisions about motorbike helmets in Uganda. And that's a direct meeting that I once attended. Look at where our big ship is sailing and keep your staff on track. I do believe that you can achieve the most of ambitious results, even in the most difficult of times. Thank you.